Imagine you are on location. You're shooting a model for a clothing brand. You have a little bit of a team around you. You're at f4, 1/500th of a second, and the shoot's going well. But the art director's looking at her screen and she's looking at it like this and she's like, do you know what? I want more separation between the model and the background. I like the background, but I just think it's getting a little bit distracting and I want to emphasize the clothing a bit more. So you say, well, okay, how much more? And then she's looking and she says, you know what, quite a lot more. So what do? You take your camera, you look at your aperture and you think, right, I'm going to go all the way to f2. That's going to still give me some depth of field on the clothing, but it's going to blow out that background a lot more. But your exposure was correct at f4. Now you're at f2, your picture is overexposed. And there's no surprise because your exposure changed, right? Because f2 is going to be brighter than f4. But how much brighter is f2 compared to f4? How are you going to correct your exposure without having to take test shots? You don't want everyone looking at you thinking, does this guy really know what he's doing? Should we really have hired this person? That's the last thing you want. You want to be able to change your settings like that. No test shots, you can just shoot. So this is where stops of light comes in. A stop of light refers to 1 unit of light. And the reason we use stops of light as a measurement is to allow us to make these kinds of changes very quickly without having to really think about it too much and without having to take any test shots. We can even use it on flash. And I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction to that towards the end of the video. So when it comes to aperture, there is a scale that you have to memorize. There's not really any way around this. You just need to memorize this. But for everything else, the calculations are really simple and easy to do, but you can just learn it in a few minutes. It's not that complicated. So there is a 1 stop of light gap between each of these aperture values. So if we look at the scale, we can see that if we go from f4 to 2.8, that's 1 stop of light. And if we go from f2.8 to f2, that's another stop of light. That gives us 2 stops of light. But what can we do with this information? How is this going to allow us to change our shutter speed really quickly? So in our example, we were at 1/500th of a second at f4, and we've changed our aperture to f2. So we've made our exposure 2 stops brighter. So what we need to do to compensate is we need to change our shutter speed to be 2 stops darker. So once we know how to change stops for shutter speed, ISO and aperture, if we know how many stops we've changed on one setting, we can compensate the same number of stops on another setting and get the same exposure but with different values. Luckily, when it comes to shutter speed and ISO, the measurements of stops are very, very easy to do. So with shutter speed, to go 1 stop darker, you just double your shutter speed. So from 1/500th of a second, double 1/1000th of a second. That's double from 500 to 1000. That gives us 1 stop. If we want to go brighter, 1 stop, we would just halve it. So we go from 500 to 250. It's really simple to calculate with shutter speed, which is really nice. Okay, so our art director's getting impatient. We need to figure this out quickly. Let's do the maths. From f4 to f2 is 2 stops. So we need to go 2 stops darker on our shutter speed. So we go from 500 to 1000, and then from 1000 to 2000. That gives us 2 stops darker because we've doubled our shutter speed and then we've doubled it again. That's our 2 stops. And so what we've done is we've achieved the same exposure in terms of brightness value. The brightness of the picture will look the same, but our depth of field has changed. Now this situation where these 2 sets of values equal the same brightness of exposure, but with different settings, these are referred to as reciprocal values. That means they give the same brightness, but the settings are different. And there's loads and loads of different combinations of these because you can make minor changes or you can make big changes. But what we're doing is we're prioritizing certain settings. What happens if you're not at these perfect values? What happens if you're at 1/125th of a second or you're at ISO 640? These are not such easy numbers necessarily to double or halve, and we can't always do the maths so easily or quickly on the fly, especially if we're under pressure. But there's a really easy answer to this, and I'm going to teach it to you now. On a camera, any camera, you have dials like these to change your settings, same on the top as well. And you'll notice when you change these settings, they click. It doesn't matter if you're changing ISO, shutter speed, or aperture. Every 3 clicks is 1 stop. It's always 1 stop. So every click is 1/3 of a stop. Now, before you start thinking this is too complicated, this is just going to make things harder. No, it's going to make things easier. Just stick with me, it's going to make things easier. This is done for a reason. The reason all manufacturers do it is so you can do the kind of calculations that I'm going to show you now. This simplifies everything massively again. Let me give you an example and it will make sense to you. Suppose I'm taking a low light outdoor portrait. I'm at f1.4. I'm at ISO 400, but it's just got a bit darker. And I changed my shutter speed to a 50th of a second. But I'm shooting on an 85mm lens, and then I think that's not going to work. That's too slow, and I'm going to get camera shake and movement from the model. I need a faster shutter speed. So whilst a 50th of a second would give me a perfect exposure, it's not going to be fast enough. So I change my shutter speed to 1/125th of a second. This is a little bit more of a complicated situation because it's not a whole stop. 50th to 100 would be a really easy calculation because it's just one stop. But 50th to 1/125th of a second, that's a little bit harder to work out. So the way that we can think about this is we've changed our shutter speed one stop and one click. So from 50th to 100th of a second was 3 clicks, that's one stop. To get to 1/125th of a second, we had to push the dial one more click, a third of a stop more. So the way we should think about this in our minds is that we should think that this is a stop and one click. We decide that we're going to change our ISO to compensate, to get us back to the right brightness value. But if we're at ISO 400 and we've gone from 50th of a second to 1/125th of a second, how do we work out immediately what ISO to be at? Well, we were just saying that the shutter speed went up one stop and one click. So what we do is we just do the same thing with our ISO. We know that we want to go one stop and one click brighter. So we go from ISO 400, we double it to ISO 800, and then we go one more click on the dial, which will take us to ISO 1000. That is the simple way to calculate more awkward values of aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. You do the whole stop and then how many clicks more. You can only be 1 click more or 2 clicks more, because if it's 3 clicks more, it's another whole stop. Does that make sense? So it's never going to be really complicated. Such as the ISO here, we went from 400 to 800, that's one stop. If we go one more click, that's ISO 1000. One more click after that is 1250, and then one more click after that is a whole stop. So this is a really easy way for us to work things out. It works for ISO, shutter speed, aperture, and flash values. That's where this gets really interesting because we can make adjustments to flash, aperture, ISO, and shutter speed and make compensation moves on any of the other settings to get the reciprocal values just using this method. So in a moment, I'm going to give you an example that would involve changing flash settings as well. But in terms of aperture, ISO, and shutter speed, if you're wondering how to get good at this and how to practice it, you don't even need to leave your home. Pick up your camera, expose for anything you like, and then think, right, okay, that was f2.8. I'm going to change to f5.6. Then you work out in your mind what you need to change the shutter speed or ISO to compensate for the aperture change. Or change another setting and do something different. Take a picture and look at them and see that the exposure looks correct. And then start doing unusual values and using that 1 click or 2 click change on top of a full stop to try and understand and get quick and good at making these reciprocal value changes. I think you're going to be surprised how quickly you can really start learning this stuff and putting it into practice. Now, I promised to include how flash works with this. I'm just going to explain another example to you briefly. So flash follows the same principles of power changes, 1/3 of a stop at a time. So a flash value on a speed light, for example, is given as a fraction of full power, which is 1/1. So that whatever that full power is will depend on the speed light itself, but it doesn't really matter. When we're doing our calculations, it's the same. Let's say we're taking a portrait of someone outdoors. We're at half power on our flash, ISO 100, f8 aperture, and the shutter speed is 1/160th of a second. But the background looks too dark. Because our flash power is so high, we're having to darken down our exposure in the camera to compensate for how much light is hitting our subject. If we want our background to be brighter, what we have to do is reduce the amount of power from the flash that's hitting our subject, allowing us to raise our overall exposure values, and that brings the brightness back up. So we're going to keep the same amount of light hitting our subject, but what we're going to do is bring up the background exposure by doing this. Does that make sense? So when our light is hitting our subject now, it's too bright, so we're having to darken down the settings. So settings such as shutter speed don't affect our flash power, and settings such as aperture affect our flash power, but it also affects our background as well. So what we do in this example is we open our aperture to f2.8. This is a 3-stop difference from f8 to 5.6, 5.6 to f4, f4 to 2.8. And by doing this, our ambient exposure gets brighter, but our flash exposure gets brighter too, because aperture also affects flash. So in order to compensate for this, we have to bring down our flash exposure. Whilst our background is now going to be brighter, our subject will be overexposed. So we need to reduce the power of our flash by 3 stops. And so this is where stops of light again comes in so useful, because it's a value that we can just apply to all of our settings. And once we understand how much a stop of light is in any of these values, we can work out our exposures really quickly. So luckily for us, flash works the same way as shutter speed and ISO. If I want to go 3 stops down from half power, half of a half is a quarter, half of a quarter is an eighth, and half of an eighth is a 16th. That makes sense? So we go from half to quarter to eighth to 16th. So a 16th power is 3 stops down from half power. But if you want to delve deeper into this, into these sorts of subjects around lighting, understanding more about natural lighting, understanding more about composition and advanced composition, much more beyond rule of thirds and stuff like that, then I strongly recommend you sign up for my newsletter in the description down below, because I have an online workshop coming out that's going to go deeply into these subjects. It's going to take you beyond the stuff that I've explained here and get you to really understand things like natural light and composition, which are much bigger subjects than people really think they are. Taking a really interesting photo, a photo that's lit with interesting lighting and interesting composition, is just so much harder than people think it is. And in that online workshop, I'm going to explain how to do it. It's like a how to see for photographers workshop. Genre independent, it's all about the concepts and theories behind this stuff. It's the sort of thing a photographer should just know, but just no one seems to know this stuff anymore. So if you're interested, go and sign up for that newsletter in the description so you can get an early bird discount code for it. If you found this video useful, I would really appreciate it if you would buy me a coffee. It helps this channel out so much. It really helps me continue making videos like this. Again, the link is down below. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. It helps the algorithm, it helps push this channel forward. And if you're new here, I'm going to be making more videos like this. Maybe you'd like to consider subscribing to my channel. Take care, and I'll see you again in the next video. Bye-bye.